People in the middle of the 14th century went to sleep believing tomorrow would be just like today, and woke up in a world that felt like it was ending. Across Europe, fevers appeared without warning, bodies weakened overnight, and strange, painful lumps rose under the arms and along the neck, as if something inside the body was trying to claw its way out. Within days, às vezes em apenas algumas horas, an entire household could go from laughter at the table to complete terrifying silence. Church bells rang so often for funerals that many cities simply stopped counting their dead, and graveyards filled so fast that fresh earth could not keep up with the number of bodies. Streets once crowded with merchants, children, and travelers became so empty that a single pair of footsteps could echo like thunder between the stone walls. All over Europe, one question whispered from doorways and echoed in the minds of the living. Was this the end of the world? What people did not know at the time was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history, an invisible storm that would kill perhaps half of Europe's population in just a few years and permanently reshape the way people worked, believed, and understood their place in the world. This catastrophe would later be known as the Black Death, a disease caused by a microscopic enemy no one could see, carried by creatures no one suspected, moving along roads that had once been symbols of progress and prosperity. And once it began its march, there was no escape in the way people imagined safety, no wall high enough, no city strong enough, no prayer certain enough to guarantee survival. To understand how shocking this fall was, you first need to understand how high Europe stood just before the collapse. The early 1300s were not a time of pure darkness. For many people, they felt like the crest of a long, bright wave. For generations, the climate in much of Europe had been unusually mild and stable, a period later called the medieval warm period. Harvests were plentiful, and fields that once struggled now produced enough grain not only to feed local villages, but also to support growing towns and cities. Over 2 centuries, Europe's population nearly doubled, and cities began to spill past their old Roman walls, bursting outward in new neighborhoods, markets, and crowded streets. Paris, Florence, Venice, London. These places were loud, chaotic, and full of energy. Carts rattling over stone, vendors shouting, church bells ringing, and the smell of bread, animals, and people mixing in the air. Above it all, Gothic cathedrals rose higher each decade, their pointed arches and stained glass windows seen as proof that society was not only closer to God, but also more skilled and more advanced than their ancestors had ever been. Even more importantly, the world was connected in a way it had never been before. A merchant in Venice could hold in his hand silk that had traveled all the way from China, spices that had crossed deserts and mountains, and coins and ideas that passed from one culture to another like a chain of sparks. The Mongol Empire had forced open and secured an enormous network of trade routes, stretching from the Mediterranean to East Asia, a system some historians call a medieval World Wide Web. These roads and sea lanes moved not just goods, but also stories, technologies, religions, and dreams, at a speed that would have amazed earlier generations. For many people living in the early 14th century, the world felt rich, promising, and full of possibility. They did not know that the same routes bringing them prosperity were already carrying something else toward them, a tiny bacterium and the greatest disaster they would ever face. The origin of this apocalypse lay far from the markets of Florence or the churches of Paris, in the vast windswept steppes of Central Asia, somewhere in the region of what is now Kyrgyzstan or northern China. This was a land of extremes, endless grasslands under huge skies, summers that could bake the earth, and winters that could cut through even the thickest fur. Here, long before anyone in Europe had heard the word plague, a microscopic organism had existed quietly for thousands of years, a bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis. It lived in the blood of small burrowing animals like marmots and ground squirrels, circulating within their communities of fleas and rodents in a dangerous but stable balance. For centuries, this deadly agent remained mostly confined to remote ecosystems, far from the crowded cities and bustling ports of the West. But the balance of nature is never permanent. In the 1330s, something changed on the steppes. Climate historians believe there was a period of ecological stress, perhaps a harsh, prolonged drought followed by sudden heavy rains that disrupted the plants and water sources these rodents depended on for survival. Driven by hunger and instability, the infected animals moved closer to human settlements and trading posts, especially along the routes of the Silk Road. Their fleas, carrying Yersinia pestis in their tiny bodies, leapt from dying animals to new hosts, including rats that lived alongside humans. In trading outposts scattered along these routes, the first human victims likely had no idea what was happening to them. They experienced high fevers, violent weakness, vomiting, and the arrival of painful swellings in the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, under the arms, and along the neck. These lumps, dark and tender, would give the disease its most famous name, bubonic plague, from the word buboes. News in the medieval world moved slowly, but fear moved faster. Long before any European city saw a plague victim with its own eyes, rumors traveled ahead of the disease like a dark wind. Merchants told stories of entire regions in the east devastated by pestilence, of lands in India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia where whole communities had vanished. Some spoke of signs in the sky, of rains of fire, and of punishments that sounded more like the pages of prophecy than simple illness. In Europe, people listened to these reports with a mix of fascination and distance. Disasters in faraway lands seemed tragic, but also strangely unreal, as if they were part of another world with different sins and different destinies. Most Europeans had no concept of germs, bacteria, or microscopic life. They had no reason to suspect that the spices they sprinkled over their food traveled on the same roads as the disease that would soon arrive at their own doors. The turning point where distant rumors became immediate danger lay along the shores of the Black Sea, on a peninsula reaching into the water like a stone spear, the Crimean Peninsula. There, a wealthy and strategically vital city stood. Caffa, a fortified colony of the Republic of Genoa. More than just a town, it was an economic hinge connecting the caravan routes of Asia to the maritime trade networks of the Mediterranean. Behind its stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and people from many lands, all protected by experienced Genoese soldiers and supported by a steady flow of ships arriving and departing across the Black Sea. In 1346, Caffa found itself under siege. An army of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire, commanded by Khan Jani Beg, surrounded the city, determined to bring this rich gateway under its control. The Genoese were masters of defense and maritime resupply, and for months, the siege dragged on in a deadly stalemate, arrows, stones, and determination on both sides. Then a new enemy entered the battlefield, one that attacked both armies without care for flags or banners. In the camps of the Golden Horde, soldiers began to fall ill. Living in close quarters, surrounded by animals, waste, and unclean conditions, they unknowingly created the perfect breeding ground for Yersinia pestis. One by one, then by the dozens, then by the hundreds, warriors collapsed with fevers and darkening extremities, their bodies caught in a rapid, unstoppable decline. The proud army that had come to conquer Caffa started to dissolve not under the force of Genoese weapons, but under the pressure of biology. Faced with the nightmare of his own forces being destroyed from within, Khan Jani Beg made a decision that would go down in history as one of the earliest examples of biological warfare. If his men were dying, he would ensure that their enemies shared their fate. He ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers to be loaded onto massive siege engines and hurled over the walls of Caffa. For days, the defenders looked up to see the sky carrying not stones, but bodies. The corpses crashed onto rooftops and into marketplaces, breaking apart on impact, spreading horror and contamination at the same time. Panic and revulsion spread through the city, but the true danger came from something nearly invisible: the blood, fluids, and fleas that accompanied these bodies in their final flight. Driven by cold and hunger as their hosts cooled, infected fleas sought new warm creatures to bite. Inside the walls that had once protected the people of Caffa from invaders, the disease now found a new, dense population to explore. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from the inside. As illness and fear spread, the wealthy Genoese merchants recognized that the city could not be saved. But they still had one resource that offered a chance at survival: their ships. 12 galleys loaded with people, goods, and countless hidden stowaways in the form of rats and fleas slipped away from Kaffa's harbor, avoiding the crumbling Mongol forces and turning their bows toward the open sea and the promise of home. They passed through the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, near Constantinople, a city that soon would face its own devastating outbreak, and sailed into the wider Mediterranean, the economic heart of Europe. At every port where they stopped for water, food, and trade, they left behind more than silver and spices. They left the seeds of catastrophe. The first major European port to feel the full impact was Messina, on the island of Sicily. When the ships from Kaffa arrived, dock workers rowed out as usual, expecting to greet tired sailors and examine valuable cargo. Instead, contemporary accounts describe something closer to a floating nightmare: decks scattered with bodies, the air heavy with the smell of decay, and the few still alive delirious with fever and covered in dark swellings that oozed blood and pus. Terrified, authorities in Messina ordered the ships to leave immediately, pushing the vessels back out to sea. But it was already far too late. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes onto the docks, and the fleas that carried the plague bacterium had found new hosts among the local rodent population and, eventually, the humans who lived there. Messina became a grim test case for Europe, and it failed. From that point, the infection moved with frightening speed. The tight, crowded living conditions of a medieval port city, narrow streets, shared wells, small rooms packed with people, acted like dry kindling ready for a single spark. Within weeks, the normal rhythm of life in Messina fell apart. Those who could fled into the countryside, hoping that distance and fresh air might protect them, but many of them brought the disease with them, carrying it to villages and farms that had never seen a ship in their lives. Word of the great pestilence raced ahead to other ports around the Mediterranean. Some city authorities, alarmed by these reports, tried to close their harbors to ships arriving from the east, but medieval systems of control were imperfect. A ship carrying valuable spices and luxuries could often purchase access with a bribe, and fear of economic loss often outweighed fear of an invisible disease. By early 1348, some of the greatest maritime powers of Europe were in chaos. Genoa, home to many of the original ships from Kaffa, was struck hard. Venice, the proud queen of the Adriatic, faced a threat unlike anything it had ever known. The Venetians, famous for their practicality and innovation, eventually developed an idea that would become central to future public health. They forced incoming ships and crews to wait in isolation on specific islands in the lagoon for 40 days before entering the city, a period that gave us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. It was a clever and forward-thinking concept, but during the first terrifying wave of the plague, it was too little and came too late to save the city from heavy losses. Gondolas that once carried lovers, merchants, and musicians now carried bodies through silent canals. Once the coastline had been breached, the disease pushed inland, following rivers, trade routes, and the movements of people desperate to escape it. Barges carried it up the Rhone, carts carried it along old Roman roads, and travelers carried it in their breath and blood to the heart of the continent. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona, enclosed by walls and packed with wooden houses leaning over winding alleys, were especially vulnerable. Many homes were crammed so tightly together that their upper floors nearly touched, shutting out sunlight and trapping smells and air in the narrow corridors below. Open drains and waste ditches ran down the middle of the streets, mixing rainwater with refuse. These cities were dynamic and wealthy, but hygienically, they were like dry forests waiting for a single match. When the plague entered such a place, it did not just take lives. It damaged the city as a living system, its markets, courts, crafts, and rhythms, until the urban organism itself seemed to falter. For people living through this, one of the most disturbing things was not just the deaths themselves, but the fact that the brightest medical minds of their time had almost no tools to understand or stop what was happening. Doctors educated at prestigious universities like Paris did not think in terms of bacteria and viruses. Their framework came from ancient theories about the four humors and about miasma, or bad air. Many believed that the alignment of planets, such as a rare configuration of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, had corrupted the air and released poisonous vapors from the Earth. If the air itself was tainted, then the natural response was to try to protect the body from breathing it in or absorbing it. Some physicians advised people not to bathe, fearing that warm water would open their pores and make them more vulnerable to this invisible corruption. Others recommended burning strong-smelling woods like juniper and rosemary in the streets, hoping to cleanse or overpower the deadly stench they believed carried disease. Treatments, too, were caught in this misunderstanding. Doctors tried bleeding patients to balance their humors, a practice that only weakened bodies already fighting infection. They lanced the swellings, piercing the buboes in an attempt to release what they thought was bad matter trapped inside. In reality, this just spread infected material and sometimes accelerated death. Again and again, the most rational strategies of the age not only failed, but sometimes made things worse. As people recognized this, a deep psychological crisis emerged. If knowledge, learning, and prayer all failed, what was left to trust? Writers who lived through the plague years gave us haunting descriptions of how societies unraveled. Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian author in Florence, wrote about families abandoning their own sick in terror. Fathers left sons, wives left husbands, and people who once would have cared for neighbors now locked their doors and refused to respond to cries from outside. Authorities could not function. Magistrates died, courts closed, and even basic economic structures broke down. Bakeries stopped baking, markets closed, construction halted. The usual soundtrack of a medieval city, carts rattling, vendors calling, hammers striking, faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. The only sound that might continue, for a while at least, was the repeated tolling of church bells announcing yet another death, until even the bell ringers themselves were gone, or officials ordered the bells stopped to reduce panic. As bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, traditional burial practices simply could not keep pace. Churchyards filled to capacity, and people began to dig long trenches, mass graves where bodies were placed layer upon layer, with only a thin covering of earth between them. For a society that cared deeply about proper funeral rites and consecrated ground, this was not just a logistical problem, it was a spiritual shock. In the 14th century, people did not separate the physical and the spiritual the way many do today. A disaster of this scale could only be understood as some kind of direct message or punishment from God. Many interpreted the plague as divine chastisement for sins, greed, pride, corruption, and moral decay. The church, long the most stable and trusted institution in daily life, suddenly found itself facing questions it could not easily answer. At first, many people responded by turning even more intensely toward faith. Cathedrals filled with worshippers begging for protection, joining in processions that wound through the streets as crowds prayed, sang, and carried religious images. Ironically, these gatherings often created perfect conditions for the respiratory form of the plague to spread from person to person. As time passed and priests and monks died at the same rate as everyone else, some people began to wonder if the church truly had any special protection or insight. In this atmosphere, a more extreme form of religious response emerged. Groups of flagellants appeared, especially in Northern Europe. These were bands of men who traveled from town to town, dressed alike, marching in solemn lines. Twice a day, in public squares, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with metal, drawing blood in a dramatic display of repentance. Their goal was to take the sins of the world onto their own bodies, hoping that this extreme penance might persuade God to stop the punishment. For onlookers, the sight could be both mesmerizing and frightening, stirring up powerful emotions and religious hysteria wherever they went. But fear, once awakened, does not always stay focused on abstract concepts like sin or destiny. As the death toll rose, many people began to look for more concrete targets to blame. When prayers seemed unanswered and traditional leaders failed to provide safety, dark rumors spread that the plague was the result of a human plot. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire and in regions of Spain, a conspiracy theory took hold. Some claimed that Jewish communities were poisoning wells to wipe out Christian populations. This accusation had no basis in reality. Jewish people were dying of the plague just like their neighbors. Pope Clement VI officially condemned these rumors and stated clearly that such accusations were false and unjust. But official words were not always enough to stop the fury of frightened crowds. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and a desperate need to find someone to blame, mobs attacked Jewish communities in several cities. In places like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne, entire communities were rounded up and killed, sometimes burned alive in their own wooden houses or in public spaces. The Black Death did not only reveal humanity's vulnerability to disease, it also exposed how fear and hatred could erupt in moments of crisis. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that this was only an urban disaster. While cities were dramatic epicenters, around 90% of Europe's population at the time lived in the countryside. The plague found its way there as well, carried by refugees leaving the cities, traveling merchants, and wandering workers. In rural areas, the spread of the disease was sometimes slower, but its effects could be even more deeply transformative over the long term. Thousands of small villages simply disappeared, their names lost to history. The manorial system, which depended on a consistent supply of peasants to work the Lord's land, was pushed toward collapse as labor vanished. Chronicles from the time describe haunting scenes: fields full of grain rotting because no one remained to harvest them, flocks of sheep and herds of cattle wandering unattended until they either turned feral or died of neglect. Wild animals like wolves, no longer kept at a safe distance by constant human activity, began to move closer to the remaining settlements, exploring spaces that had once been firmly controlled. In many places, the carefully managed medieval landscape seemed to drift back toward wilderness. By around 1350, the disease had swept all the way to the northern edges of Europe, reaching Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the remote Norse settlements in Greenland. For those fragile communities on the edge of survival, the plague may have been a final blow from which they could not recover. In just a few years, the disease had burned its way across the entire continent, from warmer southern regions to the cold northern seas. By 1351, the first and most catastrophic wave of the Black Death began to fade. The bacterium had not become kinder, but it had simply run out of easily accessible hosts in many regions. Like a fire that finally reaches a stretch of stone, it had less fuel to consume. The survivors stepped out into a world that looked on the surface very similar. Same streets, same churches, same fields, but was, at a deeper level, profoundly changed. No one will ever know the exact number of deaths. Modern estimates suggest that between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa may have died during this period. In Europe alone, it is possible that up to half of the population perished within about 5 years. Imagine every second person you know vanishing in such a short time. Every other worker, every other child, every other neighbor. In the immediate aftermath, the economic consequences were chaotic. Prices fluctuated wildly, trade networks were disrupted, and many estates found themselves without enough workers to maintain their previous way of life. But over time, something unexpected began to emerge from this devastation. With far fewer people available to work the land, labor suddenly became more valuable. For the first time in centuries, many peasants found themselves in a position of relative strength when negotiating with landowners. Lords who wanted their fields cultivated had to offer higher wages or better conditions, and some of the rigid structures tying people to the land started to weaken and, in some regions, to break. Historians sometimes refer to the following period as a kind of golden age of the laborer, a bitterly won improvement in status born from immense loss. The psychological and cultural scars of the Black Death cut just as deeply as the economic ones. Art and literature became fascinated with themes of mortality and the fleeting nature of life. One powerful image that spread across Europe was the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. Scenes depicting skeletons leading kings, popes, nobles, and peasants alike in a grim procession toward the grave. The message was simple but profound. Death is the great equalizer, and no wealth, rank, or title could shield anyone from it. For a civilization that had seemed so confident in its upward climb, building soaring cathedrals, expanding cities, and connecting continents, the Black Death was the greatest trauma it had ever endured. It shattered the optimism of the High Middle Ages and proved how fragile human systems could be when confronted with forces they did not understand and could not control. In the generations that followed, European society did not simply return to its old patterns. People became more questioning, more skeptical of simple answers, and more aware of the unpredictability of nature and fate. Political and social structures adapted slowly but significantly as labor, land, and power shifted. Over centuries, some historians see a connection between the shock of the plague and the eventual emergence of more modern ways of thinking, including challenges to traditional authority and a greater focus on individual experience. The path from medieval to modern Europe was long and complex with many causes, but the Black Death carved a deep channel in that transformation. For a long time, this pandemic was treated mainly as a distant medieval nightmare, a grim story from a remote past. But images of empty streets, shuttered homes, and a population afraid of the air itself no longer feel entirely alien to the modern world. In recent years, global society has faced its own pandemic, and suddenly, people today can more easily imagine what it is like to fear an invisible threat, to follow rumors, to argue about causes and cures, and to wrestle with both science and belief at the same time. The Black Death was, above all, a test of civilization. A test of how societies respond to fear, loss, and uncertainty. And tests, as history shows again and again, have a way of repeating themselves in new forms.